city that's doing such great work, but also to be in a lovely theater like this, and to see myself 60 years later is a very, very strange experience. It really is. It's funny because I remember much of it in little bits and pieces. I remember very distinctly, for example, being in the train yards in the movie. I remember very well being in Los Angeles on location. Being on location is a really, really intense experience. If you've ever seen it, motion picture company on location, they kind of take over the whole area, it's a very isolating sort of experience for the actors and for the crew, but also you're very intensely involved with the neighborhood or the scene or the environment, because you spend a lot of hours there, a lot of hours. And most of you probably know this, but making films is very much a waiting game. You work for a few minutes, and then they spend hours setting up the scene and so on. Production techniques have changed a lot recently, I'm told, and from what I can see. But when we were doing movies in the late 40s and the 50s, it was a pretty slow process. So you spent a lot of time in these environments. So we spent a lot of time in San Francisco, up on Telegraph Hill, which is where, if you know San Francisco, it's up where Coit Tower is. Also in Los Angeles. I also did a movie, To Hell and Back, where we did a lot of work in Central California.
Let me interject something there. It's the true story of Audie Murphy, and at the very beginning of the film, they have to have someone young playing Audie Murphy. Guess who has that role?
But it's interesting because I'm now an architect, and I do a lot of work in urban environments and with urban environments. And I really think that those experiences of being in San Francisco, being in downtown Los Angeles, and other urban settings on location, really formed my view of the urban environment and cities and so on. I remember very distinctly, there was a funicular in Los Angeles called Angel's Flight.
Yeah.
And
45-degree angle train.
Right, a 45-degree angle train that went, probably 150 feet from a lower street to an upper street. You know Los Angeles, it's very hilly. I think they've shaved off a lot of those hills now, but I remember distinctly we did a couple of scenes with Angel's Flight, but the fact is that a lot of film gets left behind and does not make the final final movie. So I also noticed a little discontinuity in the plot, where Dan Duryea knows a lot about me with it's just a snap cut. When we first meet there at the diner or at the hot dog stand.
You hit his dog with your bicycle.
Yeah, I hit his dog and I felt terrible about that. But then we were walking up the stairs to his apartment, and by then he knew all kinds of things. Perhaps we had talked about it on the way. I don't know.
It could have been in the script that you were describing more about your sister and how you lived. But I did pick up, I imagine the audience did too, some of the details about how he wasn't happy at home with his sister, that he was delivering groceries on the bicycle, that, her hat business. But let me ask you a question about Dan Duryea.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful character actor, made a lot of great films, usually played bad guys. In this film, he's actually trying to pull himself up by the bootstraps. What was he like when the cameras weren't running? Dan Duryea.
Virtually all the actors that I worked with were really, really quite wonderful to me, and in my recollection and in my experience, really, really quite warm and nice people. Duryea, as I recall, was a little bit more aloof than most. For example, Robert Mitchum, of all people, was really warm and very engaged with me and Janet Leigh and with people on the set. My recollection of Dan Duryea is that he was very nice, very pleasant, but more isolated.
Professional but aloof.
Professional but aloof would be a good way of looking at it, yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you about a couple of people. The Mary that played the mother, she's still alive. She's 92.
Well, you know, I don't remember her because if you remember, there's not a single scene where we're together.
That's true. All of her scenes would have been shot separately. You would have been on a separate.
Well, however, this is interesting. I remember the girl, the daughter.
The daughter, Melinda Plowman.
Linda Plowman. I
Who
remember.
just turned 70 in May.
Well, I turned 70 in October, and I remember Melinda because we did work together. And the reason we worked together is that we did some shots in the same places. And of course, the way the production company works is they'll try to shoot everything, all the scenes in whatever sequence they might appear in the movie. They actually shoot all at once, and that's why things get so kind of discontinuous when you're shooting.
It's a lot more economical when they're inside of the apartment if all the lights, microphones are set up to shoot all the apartment scenes day after day after day. When they're finished, then they go outside and they shoot on the stairs, or maybe they go to the park or the diner and shoot those scenes back to back to back to back.
Exactly, and as I recall, Melinda and I did scenes sort of back to back there in the apartment. Although we never appeared in the movie together because of the way they shoot.
That's interesting. You're about the same age, so.
Yeah, but for some reason, I don't remember my mother per se in that particular movie.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to a couple of other films, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
We'll start with the first one, with
Loretta Young and Celeste Holm. Yeah.
You're barely in that. You're just basically in the beginning.
It's the first movie I ever did. There was an agent in Hollywood. Don't remember her name now, but she would just find kids and get them in. She had 150, 200 kids that she represented, and she would send dozens of kids out on interviews. And somehow I got that movie. I think it was one of the first interviews I went on, and the first movie that I did. And I also recall there were more scenes, but most of them were cut.
Unfortunately. I believe I read on the internet, thank goodness for internet for research, that your father was kind of an actor, had worked in local theater, got you involved, and when you moved to LA, you were in the Pasadena Playhouse, which a lot of big stars would come out of. So you actually were in theater for a year or two before you got cast in film.
Yeah, that's correct. My dad was a kind of frustrated actor, a term they use these days, and he was actually an automobile executive in Des Moines, Iowa, where I was born. He did a couple of plays there, and I was cast in a play or two with him, where I sort of played his son in the plays. And when we moved to California shortly thereafter, the director in that playhouse where we had done a couple of those plays had suggested that maybe if I was still interested, that my folks might take me to Pasadena Playhouse. So I did, don't remember the name of the play now, but with Victor Jory. Victor Jory played the lead.
Victor Jory, who was the bad guy in Gone with the Wind,
All right,
the landowner who had the relationship on the side. Yeah. And he's in The Miracle Worker. He plays the father of Helen Hunt.
You have quite a knowledge base there.
I watch a lot of movies.
Good. Lucky.
Let's say Holiday Affair, which you co-star with Janet Leigh, one of our favorite actresses. Quite amazing to work with. What do you remember about Holiday Affair?
Well, Holiday Affair was an interesting one. I was originally cast to play a bit part, just actually no lines. It was the lead role's best friend who lived downstairs and never talked. That was part of his character. And I was cast in that part. It was a very wonderful director, Don Hartman, who later became the head of production at Paramount. But he had a son my age, and they had cast somebody else in the lead role. After about 8 days, he wasn't working out. He wasn't responding to direction, and he was sort of a low-key kind of young man. So they started the movie all over again with me in the lead role. And I have to say, to this day, I occasionally think of him and wonder where he ended up and how he's doing. But that movie, of course, as we discussed earlier tonight, Robert Mitchum had gotten himself into some trouble in the late 40s. a year or so before that movie was made. He was under contract to RKO. Howard Hughes was the head of RKO at that point. He owned the studio. And they were looking for ways to clean up Robert Mitchum's image after this trouble.
He had been arrested for marijuana possession and had not gone to trial yet, and Howard Hughes wanted to clean up his image, so he puts him into a squeaky clean romantic comedy.
Right.
And it's quite a wonderful film. In fact, if you haven't seen it, of the 31 films, that one I recommend probably the most. I think you get the most phone calls about it.
I do. And it's interesting because I still do get phone calls, and I get an occasional photograph in the mail of myself asking people asking me to sign them and so on. So it's the career. My movie career ended when I was 19, right after I did To Hell and Back, so that I could go to school and follow quite a different career. So, but it lingers on. So to be here tonight and to see this way is a pretty interesting experience for me.
Just to give the audience a little bit more background, he sold his car, his Porsche, to help fund his college. And where did you go to school?
I'd gone to school for a couple of years at UCLA and in architecture school, but I'd always wanted to come back to the East Coast, so I sold a kind of fancy, at that time, kind of fancy fun car, buy an old car and come back to the East Coast. And while I was here, just on a really lucky break, not unlike some of the lucky breaks I got in the movies, ended up at MIT in architecture school and then went on to Princeton. So I was the only person in my class that wasn't first in his high school class.
Well, I love that because we hear all the stories about child actors, about how they have a rough life and turn out bad, and you turned out pretty wonderful. You've been telling me about why you came to Washington because your son is connected to the airline industry.
Oh, well, yeah, it's interesting. My son has a passion for aircraft and airlines, and he's at school at George Washington. And has a wonderful internship with Lufthansa, so he would have been here tonight. He's very eager, but they have a big event tomorrow that he's helping to plan, so that's why he's not here. But I will be telling him all about it.
Anybody have any questions about either the film clips or tonight's movie for Gordon? There in the back and middle. Yes, speak loud and clear. Please speak loud and clear.
All right. The character's name was Cannon, and he was a photographer. Is there any connection between that character and Cannon?
Oh, that's very interesting. I think it's spelled differently.
Two N's.
Yeah, he spelled it with two N's. I think we saw it somewhere with two N's, and the camera company is spelled with one N. That's of course a Japanese camera company. While they were probably making optics and cameras at that time, they weren't. That brand certainly wasn't in the U.S. at that time. I'm quite sure. I happened to be a kind of amateur photographer and sort of watched that stuff. Those cameras really didn't come into the U.S. until 52, 53, 54. 1953 or 54.
Anybody else? That was an interesting question.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, young lady in back.
How did you manage to do all this filming and remembering all the things that you had to learn while you were a young child and go to school as a rock
How did you learn the script?
10 or 12-year-old?
Okay, well, there's two parts of that question. How does one go to school and work and also learn the lines and do this sort of things? But you're very perceptive. It was a big job. However, the schooling, the state of California, and I think most states now, have child labor laws, of course. But they made an exception for motion picture or for actors in general, motion picture, stage, and so on. We had to have a teacher on the set at all times when I was there, or when the young actors were there. And we were required to go to school 3 hours a day. And I would get my school assignments, and I'd bring my books and so on. And I had to go to school 3 hours a day. There had to be at least 20 minutes of continuous schooling to count in that 3 hours. So I would go to school for 20 minutes, 30, 40, 45 minutes while they were setting up a scene. and then go out, do the scene, and we would come back. They would set up a schoolroom. Sometimes it would be a trailer, sometimes it would be in a bus. If we were on location, the schoolroom would often be in a bus and so on. So I got basically home, almost like a homeschooling, or what we call now, of course, homeschooling. But so they were called a social worker, actually, not a teacher. And they had to be on the set at all times, including in the summer, to make sure we only worked, I think it was 4 hours a day, and went to school 3 hours and so on. But then I would have to go home, and my mother and I, usually my mother, occasionally my father, we'd have to go over lines, and I'd have to learn the lines. But an interesting fact is that I think the roles that were most convincing were where the directors knew really how to work with kids. Don Hartman was excellent at that. Reinhardt was very good at that. And they would pick up little things, little pieces of business, and put them in. The stub toe, for example.
It was added, not in the script.
That was certainly not in the script. That was something that I think happened on the set, and he said, keep it, keep it. Can you do it again? Can you do it again? Can you do it again? But the reason I bring it up in this as an answer to your question is that often the lines would not be exactly as they were written in the script. And they would say, fine, fine, let it go. It sounds natural, it sounds real. So I didn't have to learn them, in many cases, word for word.
If it's in the spirit of the moment, if you're communicating what needs to be said, even though it's not the exact same words, sometimes it's more natural, because that's one of the strengths I think you have as a child actor. You're very natural. I love the business where you're playing with the lamp when you're talking to Dan Duryea. Nobody said in the script, as he was talking to Dan Duryea, remembering the conversation that's going on, he's playing with the lamp. That was just something you did that was very human.
Well, there's two ways that business gets, or many ways that business, they call it business, at least they used to, into a movie. One is that the director thinks of it beforehand and puts it in, or it's in the script. And the third is it's just sort of, the actor will insert it, or it happens spontaneously. And I think, the degree to which some of my performances were kind of convincing was a result of really good directors being able to pick up on things and really capitalize on them and really turn them into some good stuff in the movies. And again, I was really fortunate to work with some great actors that interacted well with me and brought out my kind of way of doing things. But more important, I think, the directors. And I really learned to appreciate how really important they are.
I remember you saying that one of the directors had a child that was approximately your age, so he knew how to talk to a child.
Yeah, I think Don Hartman was by far the best director I worked with in that respect, and he had a son exactly my age. Yeah.
There was a gentleman back here with a blue shirt. Do you still have a question, sir?
Oh, yeah, different one. I was wondering, as a child, you consider the money you made?
Okay, who handled the money? Just show me the money. Yeah, again, the courts were very, very careful with that. There had been some abuses earlier. I don't remember the actors now. Some names that
Jackie Cooper.
Jackie Cooper was one. That's right, right. And there were several others that perhaps weren't quite as publicized. And so the courts were very careful with this. So, for example, when I signed a contract with RKO, we had to go to court to sign that, and the court had to approve it. My mother was the executor or the manager of my money. She did quite well with it. She was an amateur, but really good at it. And I would say there's still little pieces of that still in my portfolio, as it were. The pay was quite good, actually. But remember, we were paid weekly, and we would probably work, maybe 15 weeks a year, at most, 20 maybe, sometimes less. So some of the fabulous salaries that were paid in those days on a weekly basis were nevertheless intermittent and did not yield great incomes. It's one of the reasons I left. You know, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but the actors that we hear about and that make fabulous sums of money and have wonderful careers and so on, for each of those there are hundreds in Hollywood who are just good, solid journeyman actors and doing are comfortable, but certainly aren't famous, certainly aren't living fabulous, glamorous lives. And then for each of those, there are dozens who come to Hollywood and get nowhere. It's a very, very tough business. And, I miss it in many ways, but I have to tell you that I'm very pleased at the age of 18, I decided to pursue another career and did so.
That was kind of my question. When you were doing it, did you enjoy it? I mean, did you look for it, or was it
No,
pressure?
no, I didn't. I resented it. My friends could go play Little League, they went to summer camp, they did all kinds of things that I couldn't do. But I'll tell you something, I wouldn't trade it for the world. The people I met, the places I went, I talked a little about locations, that's just a tiny little part of the experiences that I had, that I now cherish. And I don't think just in nostalgic ways, I think, I think a lot of the things that I do today, that I enjoy today, that I see today, are a result of things that I was able to do as a child actor that most kids don't get the opportunity to do. But at the time, there was a hassle or two between my parents and I. And they pushed me a bit. My mother wasn't the typical stage mother, if you know the term, but they pushed it. They pushed it, and I'm very, very pleased they did. I just wish they'd made me practice the piano.
Over here on the side.
As a young child actor, was there any feeling of intimidation working with people who did this professionally and may have been doing it for years before you?
No, and I think that's one of the experiences. It's funny, just thinking. I think that's one of the things that I learned. I was young enough not to be terribly impressed with some very impressive people. So I just worked with them and talked to them like we're talking tonight. And I think that's helped me a lot because I tend to be a little bit more comfortable around people who should be very intimidating, perhaps. No, I got in young enough, I think, that I didn't. I think if I got in at the age of 11, 12, 13, probably then it would have been more difficult for me. But I think I got in at the right age.
I have a question about being intimidated. I've never interviewed anyone who's ever hugged John Wayne. John Wayne, 6'4", he'd been in basically 60 films before he moved Stagecoach, which made him a star. Took him like his whole life to finally win an Academy Award. And there you are, jumping on top of him in bed, and he surrendered. Do you remember anything about John Wayne meeting?
No, this sounds kind of like a cliche and just a little too good to be true, but he was a great guy. He really was a great guy. The people on the set treated him like royalty, as I think they should have. But like a lot of great people, he worked very hard to make sure that there wasn't that kind of distance and so on. But I think too, I was still at the age where I certainly didn't know his credits. And I think even if I did, I would have been much more impressed, if he were a baseball coach or something.
I don't think he played that one for about another 5 years.
Right.
Well, I wanted to ask you also, you mentioned your wife earlier. I think she came up with a brilliant idea. She suggested that you write a book about your years in Hollywood. Would you be interested in seeing a book by Gordon Gebert about your early days in Hollywood?
Well, that's encouraging. I'm on in the academic world. We get a year's sabbatical every now and then. I'm about to go on one, and that was a project that my wife, who is a scholar and writes books and does a lot of research and so on, she's encouraging me, or us actually, to do some research on the film business in the late 40s and the early 50s. Very, very special time, and sort of write not a memoir, but a view of the industry in those years from an actor's point of view. So we'll see where next year, when we'll be working on it, how it goes.
And I know a few people who would like to work with you to get copies of your films so you can write this better book. This is what we do at the Library of Congress. We believe that the best people who raised us, our grandparents, the culture that they saw, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, needs to survive so our grandchildren can learn about people that they never had a chance to meet. But tonight we've met somebody really special. I want to thank you, Gordon, for coming. I think we should move out into the lobby so we can stretch our legs. Imagine a few of you might want to visit the facilities. And thanks again for coming.